All right, welcome. So I know we're still setting up chairs. I know we're still making coffee, but because we're going to be in a little bit of a hurry, we need to start today. Sorry that we're late. Okay, so welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whoever you love, and whatever you believe or don't believe, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll. This is our adult religious education class, biblical scholarship and literacy. This is the 14th lecture, and we're going to finish Genesis today and start Exodus. If all goes according to plan, but today's going to be a complicated day, I can already tell.
I'm sorry, James, I didn't get a message that you were doing this.
That's all right. So let's see. Here is our class webpage. I want to remind everyone about this. They can go here and get past lectures. If you missed today's lecture, you can go here and get a link to it, etc. So here's what we want to do today. We want to quickly do a review of what we covered last time, which is Joseph in Egypt and Genesis. We want to overview and summarize Genesis, because we're done with it. We want to talk about it kind of from a bird's eye view. And then we want to introduce Exodus, and that's a lot to do. We've got about 45 minutes to do it in. So let's review briefly the Joseph story. This is what we did last time. And you'll remember he was a younger son. He had these dreams about his older brothers bowing to him, and they were jealous. They sold him as a slave to Egypt. He was thrown into prison. He interpreted some dreams. He ended up in charge of Pharaoh's court and redistribution system for food. And then his brothers came there to buy food from him. They didn't recognize him. He tested them to see if they had changed, and after proving that they had changed sufficiently, he embraced them and welcomed them home and said that this was all part of God's plan, and to save their family, to send him to Egypt before them to be their savior, which of course makes Joseph, for Christians, a type of Christ, and they have interpreted Joseph as a symbol of Christ. We talked about how we gave a list of 10 different ways that various Christian authors have interpreted Joseph in terms of a Christ figure. So that's what we did last time. Briefly this time, we want to kind of finish up. There's a couple verses we didn't get to read last time, so I'm going to turn to Genesis 47, and this is just after the part of the story that we told, and this is something we wanted to talk about and just ran out of time. So if we start in verse 19, this is the Egyptian speaking to Joseph. This is, "Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. So Joseph, and then skipping to verse 26, "So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's." Now, stands to this day is an interesting hint about when it was written. It was written at a later date. It was written at a time when this was the way the Egyptian economy ran. It was sort of a communist sort of economy. No, that's not the right word, because the idea is you don't own your personal property, at least not the land. Pharaoh owned all the land, and the people gave a fifth of all that they raised on the Pharaoh's land back to Pharaoh. But the land so the land belonged to Pharaoh. So what's interesting about that system is we have records from Egypt saying that is indeed how the system was set up. We also have records from Egypt saying that that was how it was set up long before Joseph supposedly lived, etc. So this is, I think, illustrative of what we have in a lot of the biblical historicity questions, and it will come up again when we talk about Exodus. Historicity is just a fancy word for saying, did this story really happen the way the Bible says it did? And if we take the story here, what we've discovered is that it contains an accurate depiction of the Egyptian economic system. But it contains a folk tradition of how that system came about. Namely, Joseph saved all the people from this famine, and they all sold their land to Egypt to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh then demanded a fifth back. And this is all because of Joseph. Well, it turns out this existed from a long time before Joseph. So again, in terms of the historicity of the story, this is a great illustration of sort of what's going on. We have an accurate depiction of the economic system. We have a folk tradition of where it came from that we know isn't quite accurate, and we know it's not accurate because, again, this system existed long before Joseph supposedly lived. But this is the Israelites looking over at their neighbors in Egypt and going, what in the world? We all own our own land, but in there the king owns all the land? That's just weird. And so they have this story about where that came from. And it gets inserted into the Joseph story. So I find that interesting. Now the Joseph story ends with Joseph going and they get his father, Israel, and they bring Israel to the land, and he comes and he blesses all of his children. Blesses may be too kind a word. Some of them he curses, some of them he blesses. So if we go to the genealogy, you remember he has children by different wives, and the firstborn of his first wife is Reuben. But you remember Reuben slept with his father's concubine, his father's wife. So Reuben is in the doghouse with his dad. And so this is the blessing to Reuben. I'm in verse 49, verse 3. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the first fruits of my vigor, excelling in rank and excelling in power, but unstable as water. You shall no longer excel, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. You went up unto my couch. Simeon and Levi are brothers, and then he goes on. And Simeon and Levi had this moment when they killed all these other the neighbors he was living with. So he talks about how their violence is cursed, etc. So each of these blessings tells you something about the people, but it's also supposed to be illustrative of the future of the tribes. He's giving a blessing for what will happen to their children and their children's children. So when we get to Judah, we get this very interesting story. Judah, your brothers shall praise you, verse 8. And your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, and your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. A lion is the king of beasts. And from his prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches low, he stretches out like a lion, like a lioness who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his legs, until the tribute comes to him, and the obedience of the people is his. So Judah is blessed to be a king. Is what those are kingship terms. The scepter won't depart from between his legs. That's the king's scepter. And so Judah is the ancestor of King David. King David is from the tribe of Judah. So again, this is either prophetic or it is some author looking back and placing a blessing on Judah's head that from him shall come the eventual kings of Israel. But it also tells us something about the freedom the authors had to both praise and kind of condemn. You remember Judah had that moment where he slept with his daughter-in-law Tamar, and we told that story earlier. It's a very fascinating story. Go back and re-listen to it. But he sleeps with Tamar, and so and then he was condemned for what he did, and then that began his repentance process. So that when he meets Joseph, he acts very nobly in trying to save Benjamin, etc. That was the test that Joseph offered to him. So for that he becomes the king, or the heir of the kings. The kingship comes from his tribe. And what's interesting about it is David, the first of the kings from his line, and the archetypical Israelite king, is both praised and condemned because David slept with Bathsheba. And what we have in the story of Judah and Tamar is a foreshadowing, and in the story of Judah and his kingship blessing, a pun. The scepter shall not depart from between the legs. This is a pun on his sexual immorality, and we get this on the prey. Thou shalt go up. This is what kings do. They go out and they kill things. But Hebrew prepositions are funny. They can have multiple meanings. It can also read, on the prey of my son thou hast gone up, which would again be a condemnation of his liaison with Tamar. And so the text is this fun sort of double meaning all the way through. It's got sexual jokes about how he was immoral, but it also has these references to kingship, and they're both in there. Now, you get the impression that if someone had written this about the ancestors of the pharaohs, they wouldn't live till the next morning. But the biblical authors seem to feel free to both praise David and condemn him at the same time. And they do this for David, in his liaison with Bathsheba, and they do it almost in a prefiguring sort of way with Judah and Tamar. And then, of course, we get the blessings of Joseph's children, and they are, Joseph's children are Ephraim and Manasseh. And so, you remember the firstborn is supposed to get a double portion? Well, the firstborn Reuben lost his birthright. And so the firstborn of the next wife, the question is, should Simeon and Levi take over? Or should Judah take over? Or should the firstborn of the second wife take over when Reuben loses his birthright through his immorality? Well, Simeon and Levi are cursed in the blessing he gives because of their violence. And so we get to Joseph. Joseph is given what's called a double portion. The firstborn gets a double portion of the father's inheritance. Well, that goes to Joseph. And Joseph's two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, become honorary adopted children of Israel, and they become part of the 12 tribes. So this is why the 12 tribes are difficult, because every time we always talk about 12 tribes of Israel. And then when they list the 12 tribes, they'll either list these 12 that are on the screen now. These are, of course, the 12 sons. So here's the 12 tribes. But sometimes they'll leave Joseph out, and they'll put his two children there instead, and that gives you 13. When you have 13, you have to leave someone else out. So sometimes Levi will be left out because Levi doesn't get a land inheritance. We'll talk about that in a later lecture. And so if we talk about land inheritance, you'll leave Levi out and you'll put Joseph's two sons in. And so every time the 12 tribes are listed, you get a different listing because it's complicated, because there aren't actually 12 tribes, there are 13. And later, the political division between the northern and southern kingdoms plays into this question of who is the heir. Because if the heir of his father is Judah, if Reuben lost it, Simeon lost it, Levi lost it, and it goes to Judah, then Judah becomes the king, and David and all that stuff makes sense for David. If you live in the northern kingdom, remember they reject the rule of David's children and offspring, and they create their own kingship. And these are the children of Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh primarily live in the north, where they reject David's rule, and these people claim the birthright. And so you can almost see the political divisions in the two nations of Israel, again, prefigured in the blessings that take place in this chapter. Interestingly enough, some of this material in this chapter seems to be very old. It uses very old Hebrew, etc. So there's some really older material in this part of the text. And like I said, it seems to prefigure a lot of other stuff. So this is interesting stuff. So let's talk about the book of Genesis. So now we finished. That's the end of the book of Genesis. 47 and 50. Yeah, we ought to stop and clap or something, because we started in April of 2018 and we finished the book of Genesis in July of 2019. It took more than a year. Okay. So, whew. I know, it's crazy. Okay, and we took some time off to talk about, about Easter, and we took some time off to talk about homosexuality in the Bible. But it took us more than a year to go through Genesis. Only one a month, but still. So let's take a breath. What in the world have we done? I want to step back because in this time we've done kind of deep dives into each of the chapters, but I want to take a step back and look at the book as a whole. So in chapters 1 through 11, we have what I'm going to call the primordial myths. These are the once upon a time stories. These are the stories of how the world was created. Like I said, 2 creation stories. These are the stories of the first children, Cain and Abel, and the stories of Enoch and Enos and all the Enoch. Enoch and Manasseh. Enoch and Methuselah. Right, these are these people who live for 1,000 years. You remember they live very old lives, and we have that incredibly vague story about how Enoch walked with God, and etc. So we have very old, interesting stories with talking snakes and worldwide floods, and Noah's story is in here, etc. So that's the primordial myth, and the material in there is intended to speak to the entire world. When God makes a covenant with Noah, it's to the entire world, and he gives commandments. And the Israelites felt like those commandments that included things like don't murder, etc., were binding on everybody. These were universal laws, things spoken to everybody. And then the book narrows to a specific family. And this is the patriarchal cycle, where we get the story of Abraham and Isaac, and then the story of Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, and then we get the story of Joseph. Now, Isaac doesn't really get his own cycle. We talked about how Isaac, is an interlude and he doesn't get a lot. But we have a whole cycle on Abraham, a cycle on Jacob, and a whole cycle on Joseph. And so the rest of the book is made up of those three chunks: the story of Abraham, the story of Jacob, and the story of Joseph. And there's very careful structure. Even though the story was combined from multiple sources, whoever combined it was very careful to create a general structure to each of these narratives. This stuff is by Gary Rens. I don't know how he says his name. Rensburg?
How's it spelled?
Gary A. Rensburg. Rendsburg. Rensburg.
That's pretty
And he, I think he sometimes grasps a little bit. He stretches to make this all fit, right? But he creates this idea that there's these parallel structures in the text. I believe that some of it is intentional. There's very clear that some of it's there, but he may stretch a little bit to get some of these details and to make it more intricate than it really is. But still, we get this stuff like the primordial myths. From A to F, we get the creation of the world and kind of the man becoming evil. So what does God do? He decides to destroy the world, and you recreate the world. And this is, again, very intentional. The flood story is a recreation, and we talked about this when we talked about the flood. And so everything starts over at A prime, and God recreates the world, and then again, it falls apart again, this time with the Tower of Babel, etc. And so God does something new. The first time it all fell apart, he destroyed the world and started over, but then he promised not to do that again. So when he starts over the second time, he picks a family, and he says, I'm going to start over with this family, and I'm going to do something special with this family that will then bless the rest of the world. And so then we get, at D prime, the moment when you start to narrow your focus down to Abraham. And so here's Abraham's story, starting with the genealogy and ending with the genealogy. And in the middle, you get Abraham's name being changed from Abram to Abraham, and he is given a promise. The promise is the central point of the Abraham story. At the end of the Abraham story, we have the test, where Abraham is tested to see if he believes the promise. But remember, the point in that whole Abraham and Isaac story, as we described it, was the promise. The promise is essential because it will become, when we get to the Exodus story, the primary point of the Exodus story. So just as the promise was the primary point of Abraham's story and the whole Abraham and Isaac sacrifice story, the point of that was to test to see whether Abraham trusted and believed in the promise. The point of the Exodus story is God fulfilling this promise. In other words, the promise to Abraham sets up why God comes down and saves the Israelites in the Exodus. He says, I'm doing it because I promised Abraham, and I'm going to fulfill my promise to Abraham by doing all these wonderful things. So all the wonderful stuff of the Exodus happens because of that promise right in the middle of the Abraham cycle. So then we get the Jacob story. And, again, Rensburg has this much longer version, but this is my version because I think it boils it down to the essentials. They wrestle in the womb. They fight from the beginning. Jacob runs away to escape from his brother, and he has a vision of God. He gets to where Abraham came from, and he marries. Then he decides to go back, and on the way back, he has this wrestle with an angel where his name is changed. And it's another encounter with God. Jacob's ladder is an encounter with God, and the wrestle with the angel is this encounter with God. And then he meets Esau, and instead of wrestling with him, he embraces him, and they're reconciled. So we have a story of the first half of contention that is turned in the second half into a story of reconciliation. And that's the life of Jacob. Which then brings us to the Joseph story, which we just covered. Remember, he and his brothers part. He's sold as a slave. We have this interlude with Judah and Tamar. Then we have this reversal where Joseph is found guilty and Potiphar's wife is found innocent when the truth is the opposite. He's this hero in Egypt where he saves them all and buys and makes sure that they don't starve in the famine. And then we have these 2 trips of his family to Egypt to buy food. He tests them, and he reveals himself to his brothers in this moving climax to the story. And then the story kind of unwinds back the way it came. There's a conclusion of the test. There's 2 tellings of migrations to Egypt. Joseph is the hero of Egypt, and that's that part we just described where he sells all the land. The people sell the land to him, and he buys it for Pharaoh. And then there's this reversal where Ephraim and Manasseh are switched in terms of who gets the firstborn right. And then there's an interlude, and then Joseph and his brothers Jacob and Joseph depart, and Jacob is buried back in the land of Israel. So this is again the structure of the Joseph story that we just told. So each of these pieces have this more intricate structure. But this is the overview of the entire book, and then you can dive into each one with its structure. There's these primordial myths that are about the world, and then it narrows to this family of Abraham. You get Abraham, Isaac, then Jacob with his 12 children. You get Joseph, who saves them in Egypt, and the story ends with the people living in the land of Egypt, where Joseph is a favored person in the court. These are, of course, the themes. There are barren women who conceive. There's favoritism in the family favoritism. There's inheritance of the younger son, and we didn't even cover that, but in Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's 2 children, again, the younger son inherits. Why? Well, again, if you think of the political implications of the story, if it's written to cement David's reign, among other things, David was the younger son of Jesse, and he's the son of Judah, who is not the firstborn of Israel. He's the wrong tribe, and he's the younger child, etc. So you get all these stories of the younger son inheriting that kind of legitimizes what happens with David. But it also has this feel of the underdog. These are the underdog stories that everyone loves. Everyone loves a good underdog story, right? And Israel loved a good underdog story, especially because they lived right sandwiched between Babylon and Egypt, 2 big powerhouses, and then above them were the Hittites. These big powerhouses of important control in the ancient Near East, and they were constantly the underdog. And so the stories of the underdog triumphing over the overdog with God's help were very motivating to the Israelites, both for political reasons for David and for their own kind of social narrative of what it was like to be an Israelite. There was deception. They liked there was part of the underdog narrative. This is the trickster narrative, where somebody who's an underdog rises to the top because they trick or outsmart the people that were oppressing them. But then the Bible has this fascinating pattern where what goes around comes around, and they are in turn tricked later on in the story. So we have repeated over and over again this trickery narrative that happens. There's motifs of estrangement and reconciliation that happen from the Joseph story to the Israel and Esau story, etc. And then finally there's promise and fulfillment, which is, again, the core. When we talk about Abraham having faith in God, it's not about faith that God exists, which is how we think of faith in God. It's Abraham knows that God exists. It's, does Abraham trust God enough to believe his promises? Because God's fulfilled promises are core to the Israelite identity. As an underdog living among these powerhouses, they believed that God had promised them that this land would be theirs and they would succeed. And so, do they trust God enough to fulfill that promise was an important point to them, because it allowed them to survive among their more powerful adversaries. So, that's the narrative of Genesis. Now, breathe for a minute, because I'm going to put that in the larger story of the Bible. The Bible itself has a core narrative, and Genesis plays an important part. Genesis is the preamble. So we have a preamble, and then we have a Moses and Exodus, and the birth of Israel as a nation. So there's a preamble that sets the stage and sets up the promises. Then we have the next few books that talk about the birth of Israel as a nation to fulfill those promises. And then we have conquest and the establishment of Israel as a nation in Joshua and Judges, where they go back to the promised land and conquer it. And that's, again, fulfillment of the promise. And then there's the kingship and the history of the nation of Israel. Once they conquer the land, then the kings rule, and then we have the history of their rule. And this is where we know for sure that the story becomes historical, because we have alternate accounts of these kings. We know they really lived, etc. What were you going to... Yeah, go ahead.
Is Levi, Leviticus, are they related?
Yes, the book is related. So Levi doesn't get an inheritance in the land. He becomes the priest. So his inheritance is priesthood. And so Leviticus is this book that has to do a lot with the rituals the priests perform. And so Leviticus, Levi, etc. gets named together. So if we think of this, we got a preamble, a birth of a nation, a conquest, and then the history of the nation. And if you put that kind of in a narrative story, you have Babylon, because that's where you start. Again, forgetting that there's the mythical history, but once you get into the patriarchal history, you start out in Babylon. That's where Moses lived. That's where Abraham lived. And God calls Abraham to leave Babylon and go to the promised land. So he does. So he leaves polytheism in Babylon and becomes this father of monotheism in Canaan. Traditionally, the father of monotheism. The text seems to hint, actually, that Abraham's still a polytheist, but that's a whole other story. And so then Israel is forged in Egypt. We have the Exodus story, and they go back to the promised land and become the kingdom of Israel. So it's Babylon, is promised land, Egypt, promised land, and then Babylon. Because the story ends with the destruction of Israel due to their polytheism and their unwillingness to remain monotheists, and then they end up back in Babylon where they started from. So Abraham is called out of Babylon because he's called out of their polytheism to monotheism. Then we have the promised land, Exodus, promised land, and then the nation is established, and then they become polytheists. They worship other gods, and the text implies that that's the reason that they're destroyed and taken back to Babylon. So this is a loop, right? You start in Babylon, you end in Babylon, and it's this whole, the whole story comes full cycle. And this is the larger narrative. And so again, most people think that a lot of this story was compiled just after the Babylonian captivity, while they were living in captivity in Babylon. And so they saw this whole thing as a cycle. And what they had to wrestle with is, if the promises to Abraham were that we would live in this land and it would be ours, how do we explain the fact that we're stuck back in Babylon where this whole thing started? And of course, the answer to that is this idea that we didn't live up to the promises, and we became polytheists, and we didn't worship God, and because we worshiped other gods, we lost the protection of God, and we were taken back to Babylon. Most people believe that this is how true monotheism began, because if you read the text, the Israelites are not good monotheists during this entire story. Right? They are busy worshiping other gods, and so monotheism as a practice really doesn't take off until after the exile. And when the narrative explains that the exile happened because of their polytheism, then they kind of latch onto this idea of real monotheism, and that's when Israel becomes a monotheistic nation. And so if you're interested in that story, I have an earlier lecture, and I will put links to that in the course webpage so you can go find it, and in the video description here for this one. And I gave a sermon in the main hall on the evolution of monotheism, and I talk about this whole story, and this is how it fits into the larger narrative. So, if we think about what we've just done with Genesis, a pretty big chunk of this whole biblical narrative is in Genesis itself. Genesis sets everything up. It starts us in Babylon. We get Abraham called from polytheism in Babylon to monotheism. We get the promise of the land of Canaan, and all of that chunk of the larger cycle comes in Genesis. And that leaves us with Exodus, right? We're right at the boundary where we're ready to start doing the Exodus, which we will introduce in just a second. So if you want to learn more about the book of Genesis, these are some recommended resources. There is a great courses lecture called The Book of Genesis, and this has that same guy that created those parallel structures I showed you earlier in his work. He is a bit of a maximalist in the sense that he rejects some of the documentary hypothesis that I would accept. He believes that a lot of this stuff is historical. He thinks Abraham was a real person, etc. But he has a really good grasp of kind of the Hebrew and the literary styles and things. And so if you want to learn about literary styles, he's a really good source. If you want to learn about the documentary hypothesis and some of that other stuff, this is a really good source. This is a bit more liberal commentary, but I like it. He also did a translation I read from several times in the Genesis course. So this is a really good source for learning kind of the standard scholastic consensus. So here's the literary material. Here's the scholastic consensus on authorship and that sort of thing. And then this is a Jewish commentary, which is really good at pointing out some of the word plays and things that otherwise we would miss. It's got the text in Hebrew and the text in English, if you don't read the Hebrew, put next to each other with this long list of commentaries, including all the word puns and things that are in the text that are just brilliant and clever, and they don't translate. And so if you need to read it with a commentary to really appreciate what's going on. And this is a great source for that. It's, again, a Jewish source, so you get it from a Jewish perspective, etc. So, Genesis is done. That's it. That's the big view. That's the details. We've gone through all of it, and we're ready to jump into Exodus. Does anyone want to make a comment or question about Genesis before we take in a dive into Exodus? Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, the thing that I find really interesting is that they, just how they deliver. Once you told us that they deliberately went so far back so that they wouldn't conflict with any Egyptian history, it made a decent amount of sense, because the Egyptian history goes back about 3,000 years before Christ, and they went back 4,000 years, so that gave them a lot of advantages. Is there any other little tricks like that?
You're talking about the why the patriarchs lived so long. Is that the...
Oh, no, you told us a separate reason for that. It's because that was before they started keeping track of dates all that accurately. And
Yeah.
It's really common, and you saw with other kings.
But those are related. So what seems to happen is they keep track really well of the names. They kept genealogies. They like genealogies. But if the early patriarchs that they had in their genealogy lived a normal amount of time, then you end up with Adam right in the middle of where there were recorded history from Egypt. And so if you have this list of names that you believe are your ancestors, but you have to push Adam back before recorded history, then you just make people live really long. And then suddenly Adam is living before Egyptian recorded history. And so those are related, but there might have been something else I said and don't remember what we're talking about. But
let me try something else then. There is a UFC fighter named Cain Velasquez, and why on earth did his parents name him that? Is there a tradition in certain cultures to use names that are otherwise looked down upon a lot of ways?
I don't know.
Or is it just a weird quirk of his family?
I don't
never
know.
understood why that would happen.
Well, Cain was obviously not a popular figure in the Bible, so I'm not sure why people would name people after Cain.
Yeah, that's his birth name. It's not like that professional wrestler who became a mayor in Tennessee recently. I think his name's Glenn Jacobs.
I don't know why that would happen. I'd have to ask his parents. Obviously, I don't want to speak for him. I do know that there was a folk tradition that the mark placed on Cain was dark skin. This is an early American folk tradition. This isn't actually how the Israelites, for example, interpret it. But early Americans who had slaves of African Americans interpreted the mark on Cain as black skin. They interpreted the Ham, one of the children of Noah, as having married a descendant of Cain and preserved the black skin. And then they interpret the curse on Ham, that he will be a servant of servants, as referencing again the black skin and why it's okay to enslave black people. They interpret it this way, and that is, it's not the intent of the original text. It's very clear, in fact, that Ham's descendants are not from Africa at all. But that's a whole other discussion. And his children, Canaan, who are cursed, again, that they're not of African descent to be slaves. So it doesn't hold up biblically. It's not what the original authors thought. It's this weird American interpretation. But I have seen a couple attempts to kind of reclaim Cain as a besmirched. And again, this is a reaction to a misinterpretation where you say, well, if you're African American, maybe, and you've been told this story about how Cain is the origin of African American, then maybe you think that Cain's story has been
misinterpreted.
Right, and he's maligned. So we're the descendants of Cain, and we're proud of it because Cain is a maligned character, that sort of thing. But again, this is not what the Bible is really about. Go ahead.
A whole different story, which you don't need to get into, is the descendants of Ishmael.
Yes, but that one is interesting because throughout this patriarchal story, there are branches of Israel's family that get named, and they're very intentional references to other nations around Israel. And so these are the folk stories of where the Moabites, for example, come from. In Hebrew, Moab means father, so the Moabites are from the father. And so you get this story of Lot sleeping with his daughters, and he names his child Moab, and he's the ancestor of the Moabites. And that's an attempt to malign their neighbors, because they probably thought it was this great idea. We're from the father, right? This is a positive thing, and the Israelites turned that into a negative thing. The story of the conflict between Jacob and Esau is a prefigurement of the political conflicts between the Edomites and the Israelites, because Esau is the ancestor of the Edomites, according to the story. So these are folk stories of where these people came from, right? And the Ishmaelites are the desert tribes who live down in Arabia, and this is, again, a folk story for where they came from.
And so the Quran picks up on this.
And the Quran picks up on this and then swaps who actually was sacrificed by Abraham, etc. Because the Bible was claiming they were the children of Ishmael. They probably aren't. They decided themselves that they're the children of Ishmael because the Bible says they were. And then they turned the story on its head to say that we're the favored children of Abraham. And the Quran turns the story on its head. But yes, all of that's connected to the Quran and to how that works out through Islam, etc. So, should we dive into Exodus? Any other comments about Genesis?
Nothing comes to mind right now. Are you sure? It might be a little early to dive into Exodus right now. So, or do you have? I take it you have a good plan for this.
We got 15 minutes, and I'm just going to introduce the story. I'm not going to tell it. I'm going to introduce it so that we have an overview, and then we can dive into the text when we come back next month.
Okay.
So, the Exodus story. This story is the deal. This is the story that if you're a Jew, you're supposed to remember. You're supposed to think of yourself as having lived through yourself. Every Passover, they tell this story over and over again. This is the national story of identity for the Jewish people. And as such, when we move into Christianity, it's a story that's mythologized in the sense that they see symbolic elements in it that point to Christ. And so for the Jewish, or for the Christians, this is a story of redemption that prefigures the story of redemption of Christ. And so this is a core story for the Israelites. It's a core story for the Christians. And of course, for African Americans in America, it became a core story because it's a story of freedom from slavery. And they latched onto that, and it became part of the story of the abolitionists. And so this is a story that has important historical elements through all of American history and also through Israelite history and Christian history. So it's very important. It's key. This story is the story. This is where it all kind of comes together. So again, if we have the biblical narrative, they end up in Babylon. There is some stuff, what happened after these. This is after the Exodus, after the captivity where they go back. But if this is Genesis, this is Exodus. And it sits right at the pivot point, kind of this whole narrative. If we tell the story, because I think it's tempting to assume everyone knows this story, and I probably shouldn't. And so, if we're going to talk about the significance of individual points, the significance of points are interesting because they foreshadow later points in the story, And so, I want to just step all the way back and just tell the story. And it is, they start out in the promised land, and there's a famine, so they travel to Egypt to buy grain. They then settle in Egypt, and that is where Joseph meets them and the whole thing. Joseph was sent before them to protect them, and so that's where we left them, in Egypt with Joseph. There they grow too numerous. And so the Pharaoh decides on 3 plans to take care of the fact that the Israelites are just too numerous. There's just too many of them. And the first of his plans is he enslaves them. And it doesn't work. They keep growing. And their population is growing. And it says they're growing so large that the Egyptians are afraid of them. Again, this is one of those elements that is historically dubious. But the Israelites were so numerous that the Egyptians were afraid of them. So they enslaved them. Didn't work. They're still growing. So they tell the midwives to kill all the male children. Of course, just the males, because if you want to destroy someone's national identity, you destroy the males. The women were treated as property. They marry men of your community, and then they become Egyptian. So you kill the males and you take the women, right? So the Pharaoh wants to kill all the men. And that doesn't work because the midwives refuse to do it. And again, we have a trickster narrative. In this case, it's lowly women midwives who are undermining Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and making sure that these children don't die and saving the children of Israel in the process. So these people are heroes. Again, it's the weak overcoming the strong. It's a narrative that the Israelites will like. So when that fails, he decides he's going to drown them all in the Nile. Take them in and drown them in the Nile. This begins this story of water. The Nile and drowning in the Nile is an important part of the narrative. It harkens back all the way to creation. It's going to be important when we part the Red Sea and all that other stuff. So, enter Moses. Moses is saved from this destruction of the children, which, by the way, is picked up in the Christian narrative in Matthew, where Herod decides to kill all the children to make sure that Christ isn't born. Do you remember this story? This is again borrowed. It's intertextuality or mimetics. It's one text imitating another text to make a theological point. And so the New Testament will borrow this story of the killing of the children and put it on Herod's head. So Pharaoh decides to kill all the kids, and Moses is spared. And Moses is spared because he is put in a wicker basket and floated down the Nile. And we'll talk about the significance of that. In a story that's eerily similar to Sargon the Great's story. Again, we have borrowing this time from Sargon the Great's story into the Israelite story, because that's exactly the childhood story of Sargon. And so Moses is spared. He kills an Egyptian. He runs away, and he goes to a place in Midian where he marries the daughter of the high priest of Midian. And then he meets a god there who is called Yahweh, which is a Yud-He-Vav-He. It's a attested Midianite deity. And this Midianite deity says, and I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which would have been surprising to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, probably. But this is very convenient, right? The God of his father-in-law just happens to also be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These two gods get merged, and this is, again, part of the origin of the Hebrew God. And then Moses is told to go back. This is the burning bush experience. He goes back to Egypt. He saves the children of Israel, and he drags them out to the Mount Sinai where he met God. And there we have the Ten Commandments and the covenant and all the laws, and the majority of the first 5 books of Moses happen at the mountain. And it's all about the laws and the commandments and all this stuff that happen on Mount Sinai. And then they wander for 40 years, and then they cross the River Jordan. It parts, and they enter the Promised Land. And I think I actually skipped the parting of the Red Sea. I can't believe I did that, right? Remember, on the way out, he parts the Red Sea, and the Egyptians drowned in the river, in the water, just like they had done to the Israelite children. This is what goes around, comes around things. And Pharaoh tries to drown the Israelite children, so he's drowned in the Red Sea. Okay, so that's the story. There is a Christian allegory here. From slavery to sin, which Paul is a fan of, crossing the Red Sea and in his baptism for Paul. You get to the Mount Sinai where temple and atonement happens. You wander in the wilderness. These are the tests of life. And you pass the River Jordan or the Veil, and you enter the Promised Land, which is this idea of heaven. And so this entire story has a symbolic, allegorical interpretation from Christ's atonement that helps you escape through this killing of the lamb, etc., all the way to the temple and the covenants and things that eventually bring you back to the Promised Land. So I am out of time. I am going to mention the common questions that people ask, and then we're going to start the narrative of Exodus, and we'll just start at the beginning and start reading next month. We'll start at Exodus 1 and start reading this story. But people are very interested in authorship. Who wrote it? Well, we already covered that with Genesis, and the narrative really just carries over to Exodus. It's the same debate, same discussion, and same reasons for believing in multiple authorship. Jethro's name, he has 2 different names depending on which author's tradition you're looking for. Mount Sinai is either Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, etc. So there's reasons to believe in the same multiple authorship that started in Genesis, carries over. There's a whole discussion of law and ritual. And this is the law of Moses that's given on Mount Sinai. What does the law mean? What are the implications? and how did the Jews interpret the law. So we could spend forever talking about Mosaic law if we wanted. We could probably spend the rest of our lives doing that. Jews do, and it's a lot of good, clean fun. But we're not going to do that. But we can have this whole development into law. And then we can talk about the meaning and theology of the text. Again, that's sort of the thing I just did with the Christian allegory. So these are the themes and the sort of questions we can hopefully answer as we go through the text of Exodus. So as we read Exodus, we'll go through looking for issues relating to authorship, looking for issues related to the historicity of the text, because this is fodder for a large amount of Christian apologetics. They're very interested in proving that Exodus really happened, and so they write book after book after book, trying to prove that Exodus happened, just as the Bible says. And again, I think that's a kind of a mistake. And we'll talk about historicity. We'll talk about the issues related to it. But I will give you my approach before we begin, and that is, I believe in mythicized history, meaning something happened, and then we get myths that build up around it as the story is passed from one person to the other, orally, etc., and the story builds and grows and gains complexity with a kernel of something that really happened. And there's all sorts of very interesting hints that something really happened, something real happened that sparks this entire story. And then it gets these growths of myths on top of it. So I'll talk about that. These are my resources, and then just give me this so we can quit, because we got 10 minutes, and then we'll chat. So if you want a good overview of that approach of mythicized history, the Oxford Annotated Bible has an introduction to this book of Exodus. It's 2 pages, and it's really good, and it's exactly how I kind of think about this. There are 2 really great commentaries, one on the first half, one on the second half of Exodus, that I recommend, by William Propp. And then Pete Enns did this great lecture, The Bible for Normal People. It's a podcast. The podcast, The Bible for Normal People, has 3 and growing episodes on Exodus called Pete Ruins Exodus, part 1, 2, 3, and I'm guessing he'll eventually have 4, 5, and 6. Those are really fun. If you want to see it from a believer perspective, from somebody who's a liberal Christian believer in the text, but doesn't necessarily believe in all the historicity things and would agree with me about mythicized history, here's a guy who kind of believes, but takes that approach. It's a fascinating way to look at what happened. This book is really useful. I've got a copy up here. It has all sorts of texts related to the laws, and I will be quoting from it over and over again as we go through this. It has, for example, the story of Sargon's birth, which so closely parallels Moses' birth, including both put in a wicker basket and sent down the river. All that comes from this book. It's excellent. I've given some related lectures. This one on Mesopotamia is a lecture I gave that is related to Sargon, and thus related to Moses. So if you want to hear what I said about Sargon's birth, etc., that's in this lecture. And there's also these great movies. And so what I want to do is I want to ask John if we can have a movie night, maybe a couple, and watch some movies. Now, there's a lot more going on in these stories than the movies cover, right? And we'll talk about all that other stuff. But the movies are great for just getting this bird's eye view of how people look at these stories. And we got to watch Prince of Egypt. We got to watch Charlton Heston and the 10 Commandments. And we'll see if we can have some movie nights over the next few months as we cover Exodus. Maybe we'll also have some movie nights to go along with it, and we'll watch some of these. These should be fun. So we're ready to do the Exodus, and I'll see you next month, and we'll start reading the thing. All right. Thank you. I'll see you next month.